Okay. All right. So, good morning and good afternoon, and welcome to the fifth webinar in our series. We're delighted to have you with us again as we continue to explore new perspective on the Holocaust in Southeastern Europe. Today, it is our great pleasure to welcome Dr. Vjeran Pavlakovic. Dr. Pavlakovic is a professor of history and cultural studies at the University of Rijeka in Croatia. He received his PhD in history in 2005 from the University of Washington and has published articles and books on memory politics in Southeastern Europe, transitional justice in the former Yugoslavia, and Yugoslav volunteers in the Spanish Civil War. He's a co-editor of the volume Framing the Nation and Collective Identity in Croatia, which was reissued in Croatian in 2022. Since 2023, he's the co-PI for the Slovenian-Croatian project Mnemonic Aesthetics and Strategies in Popular Culture. Current research includes graffiti and murals as sites of memory, slow memory and Balkan conflicts, and a history of Dalmatian immigrants in the American Holocaust. Today's lecture is titled The Holocaust, Genocide, and Memory Politics. The lecture analyzes memory politics and the Holocaust in Croatia, its independence. Participants will be introduced to various concepts related to collective remembrance, explore comparative approaches to dealing with the past, and then discuss specific case studies related to Croatia, including monuments, commemorations, memorial museums, and artistic interventions since 1990. The lecture will also offer strategies on how to use visual material and sites of memory as educational tools. We are truly honored to have Dr. Pavlakovic with us today and are grateful for his willingness to share his research, time, and insights. So please join me in welcoming Vjeran Pavlakovic. Vjeran, it's all yours.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for the invitation, of course, Sandra, and organizing everything. And I know this has been a lot of work. It's been going on for many months now, and I know that it looks smooth, but behind the scene, I'm sure there was a lot of work. So, congratulations on making it at least to the fifth one. Hopefully, we'll complete the entire series. And I was like being in person with the audience, but I'll go with the Zoom for now. This allows us to be transnational. Now, here's where this will work or not. Sharing of the Zoom. How are we doing? Is it
We're doing well. We can see it. I have one question for you before you begin. Sometimes our participants will paste questions in the chat as you're teaching, and you may or may not be able to see the chat because you're having a presentation mode screen. Do you want me to stop you, or we just leave all the questions for the end?
No, you can go ahead. Just let me know if there's something popping up.
Okay. All right. Thank
A
you.
question pops up. Okay, hopefully. Um, and this is changing, yeah?
Yep, it works.
Okay, good. All right. Well, so again, thank you for the invitation, and looking forward to chat with the participants. And I know you've had already quite a few lectures about the topic, probably more from like a history perspective. And I am a historian by training, but I've been working on memory politics probably for the last 18, almost 20 years. And I'll explain a little bit what those are. And we'll be talking about some sites which you probably have also already talked about in the past. I think Emil already gave a lecture about Jasenovac and the camp, so you probably know some of the background to that. And you'll be having a lecture with Katarina Damčević, who I think is also in the audience today, and she'll be going deeper into some of the symbols that I'll briefly mention in today's lecture. So hopefully it'll fit in into the grand scheme of things. So I've chosen this image as the first one because it sort of illustrates these memory politics and the debates about the past, especially for our region. And it's about the numbers of victims. And this is dealing with Jasenovac and how many people died there and what ethnicity they were. And Um, well, the denial or the exaggeration of those numbers. And this is actually in the site of Donja Gradina, which I don't know if Emil talked about that as well. It's on the other, it's on the Republika Srpska side um, of the camp. So it's an actual memory site that's divided into two parts in two different countries with two different narratives. So we can see how complicated it's already getting. And these two curators that I've photographed here, uh, one on the right, Andriana, is my friend, was working in the Croatian side of the Jasenovac Memorial, and the other guy was working on the Republika Srpska side. And here they are in front of these numbers. And I thought it sort of illustrated the debates and the divisions that we're talking about, which moves um, beyond the simple facts and thinking about the Holocaust, as an event and how we deal with it. So I'll go really quickly over the history since I know we don't have that much time. But I just wanted to illustrate, there was a lot of wars in the former Yugoslavia, and you've probably talked a little bit about at least Second World War, I'm guessing. But there was um, another war or series of wars in the 1990s. And then we also had this period of the communist regime from 45 to 1990-91, or socialist Yugoslavia, or communism. Various people use different terms for it. So, in fact, when we're talking about memory politics, we're talking about many different traumas, many different wars. Sometimes they're separate, sometimes they overlap, and various actors or mnemonic actors, as they call it in the memory studies business, use the various wars and memories and selective history for contemporary politics, because that's what we're really talking about today, is about contemporary politics. And for the former Yugoslavia, I mean, there's many narratives of the Second World War. One of the simpler versions, we could say, between resistance and collaboration with various collaborative regimes, whether it was the Ustasha regime, which I know you spoke with Daniel, probably also with Emil, probably also Lovro. So hopefully you know what I'm talking about here. I don't have to get into too many details, but there were other collaborationist movements, the Chetniks, for example, which were a royalist Serbian movement loyal to the king, who was in exile, but then later collaborated with Italians and with the Nazis, and movements in Kosovo and elsewhere. And really the only multi-ethnic anti-fascist resistance movement was the Partisans, led by Josip Broz Tito. We see him here at the bottom left with Kocha Popovic, another one of his commanders, who were anti-fascist. It was national liberation, but it was also a communist movement and led by a communist party that had communist revolution in mind at the end of the war. And that is exactly what they did. And you've probably already seen a version of this map, just to situate ourselves with this independent state of Croatia that had concentration camps, quite a few of them, but the main one, Jasenovac, as I mentioned. And that one is the one that elicits the most debates. And that's what we'll be talking about today. Then there was this after the Second World War, there was the socialist Yugoslavia with the six republics and the two autonomous provinces, which seemed to work for a while. And then, we could talk about how the Yugoslav state dealt with the past. In many ways, it didn't deal with it. It brushed it under the carpet. It created a narrative of brotherhood and unity, of everybody was um, all the different peoples and republics fought together against the foreign occupiers and their domestic collaborators. So there were collaborators, but the emphasis was on fighting together as in this brotherhood and unity. And if we think about it, I mean, maybe it does make sense, after this brutal war with so many different layers of interethnic violence, and also the Holocaust was in there, and genocide, and these very nasty things, it's very difficult for a multi-ethnic country or political unit to come back together. So their strategy was to emphasize the heroic victory and not really talk about the dark past and the victims and the horrible mass crimes and atrocities that happened there. I mean, they were commemorated, as I'll show you in a little bit, but they weren't necessarily investigated. they were depicted as victims of fascism, to just instead of saying victims of Croats who killed Serbs or Serbs who killed Muslims, etc. Because again, thinking about moving forward, you had to kind of deal with the past very quickly and then move forward and rebuild the country, which worked for a while. And then we know that the country fell apart in the 1990s. I'm not going to get into the details of the camp because you've already had a whole lecture about it, but two figures of memory or main sites of memory, which I think really illustrate the Second World War for Croatia. And that's kind of my emphasis because I live and teach here. So a lot of the examples will be from Croatia, but if you have questions about the other parts of the former Yugoslavia, feel free to ask as well. But that would be two lectures or entire series of lectures. But the 2 points, one is this Jasenovac camp that you've heard about, and the second one was the crimes that took place after the partisans took power. And for the Croatian imaginary or collective memory, it's a place called Bleiburg, which is a small village in Austria near the Slovenian border, because a lot of these Ustasha armies and other mobilized people and civilians fleeing north, trying to surrender to the British, get stopped in Bleiburg, get handed over to the partisans, and then they get brought back into Yugoslavia, and tens of thousands are killed or imprisoned, um, or disappeared. And this was not talked about then for 40 years. So two kinds of traumas, and I'm not trying to equivalent or make them equal or suggest that Bleiburg and Jasenovac were the same. It's just two of the main sort of traumatic points. There are many other sites of memory, and many other the national groups or ethnic groups had their own traumas from this war. For example, when the partisans took power in Serbia in October 1944, so about 8 months before this, many of Serbian collaborators or royalists were killed by the partisans already in Serbia. They never made it all the way here. So this was mostly a Croatian side of memory, which has been mythologized and abused and exaggerated quite a bit. So again, not trying to equate the two events, but I think it's useful to think about the various narratives, which will hopefully help us understand why the Second World War and why the Holocaust and why genocide are still such powerful, again, sites of memory and open for political abuse and misuse in Croatia. And here's just symbols of how they're commemorated, because I had a previous project called Framnat, Framing the Nation, and Collective Identity. And my team, we went for 4 years, we went to 7 commemorations, 5 related to the Second World War, 2 related to the war of the 1990s, the Croatian War of Independence. And we went and listened to the speeches and observed the people and followed the rituals that take place there. So these, as I said, these two seem to be very powerful sites of memory for Croatia and how Croatia understands the Second World War. And we already see the monuments or the kind of places where these commemorations takes place. And you can see in the front on the second picture on the right, someone's actually dressed like an Ustasha. So this was in the mid 2000s, probably 2008, 9, 10, somewhere around there when I took that photo. And that is now pretty much been banned in Austria. But there were many other monuments. So I know in the little intro blurb, I had said I was going to help you use visual techniques. I mean, I didn't really plan a workshop, but I mean, I will have a lot of examples. So if people maybe want to take notes or have questions about my methodology, feel free to ask. But so, for example, here are two kinds of monuments, because after the Second World War, as I said, the Yugoslav state tried to, how do you deal with the trauma and these memories? And they try to make a heroic narrative that, on one hand, had many of these classical kind of monuments that you see on the left, these figurative monuments, obviously stomping on a Nazi flag, but they created this socialist modernist monuments, or spomeniks, as some people have called them, very abstract, very future oriented. What does this represent? It could be all kinds of things. So they were very ambitious in their aesthetics. Uh, Obviously, even today, people are fascinated by them, but, did they actually serve their purpose? We can discuss that if it worked. So the Yugoslav state definitely tried to deal with the past. Interestingly, though, the Holocaust wasn't um, a separate event. It had been subsumed in the overall anti-fascist struggle. And because I'm not a scholar of the Holocaust per se, I'm more of a memory scholar of monuments and memories and commemorations. So there's probably even more reasoning, and maybe Lovro touched upon this, or maybe some of the other colleagues dealt with it in more detail. But I mean, one thing is that we know that Yugoslavia also supported the non-aligned movement and a lot of the Arab states in the Cold War. So there was also that relationship with Israel during the Cold War, which probably affected Yugoslavia's decisions how to deal with the Holocaust. So the Holocaust actually was very minimally discussed outside of the broader anti-fascist movement. And as I said, there was lots of monuments that were being built, all kinds of things. And then we have the 1990s, where it's not just the Yugoslav state is collapsing and the Communist Party, but actually the memory is also uh, being collapsed. I mean, here I have this image of a monument that's been destroyed. And we have the wars of the 1990s breaking everything up again. And this one's maybe a complicated map, but it shows a lot of the different ethnic groups and to try to understand, what was the logic of ethnic cleansing. And in many cases, it wasn't per se to eradicate the other ethnic group, it was to make nation states or borders that made sense where you had, just one ethnic group in there, whether it was a greater Serbia or some kind of greater Croatia to fatten the croissant shape, the crescent shape there, or other things. So we can just see the complexity of Yugoslavia in this ethnic map, especially in regions of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Is there a question, it looks like, or a comment, or no?
No, it just says complicated map. So,
Okay. And then here's just another updated map to see where we're at right now, with 7 successor states after the collapse of Yugoslavia. Uh, and now in the present, we're dealing with still a lot of memory of the Second World War. Even though you'd think, over 80 years after the end of the Second World War and 30 years after the end of the wars of the 1990s, it is again present in popular culture, in aesthetics, in music, and in everyday politics. So it seems to like we are unable to move beyond this. Uh, so part of it, it's contested history, and the Second World War is also part of these founding myths of these new states. And there's also these, political legitimacy after the 1990s. Uh, for example, I spoke with a colleague for a lot about this. He's a political scientist and a historian. And he said, like, if you read the political platforms of the two main parties in Croatia, the HDZ and the SDP or SDP, the Socialist Democratic Party, their platforms are very similar, about neoliberal politics, being part of the EU, all these things. The only difference is their position on the Second World War. So in many ways, that's why it's still, I don't know, has traction. And we have these ethnic identities still in the borders and the imaginations that are still present. And I use this term here, blurring of the past and the present, but it's actually blurring of many pasts into the present. So not just the Second World War, but also the legacy of communism and the War of the 1990s. So it's, these three kind of narratives intertwining, sometimes in popular culture, other times actually in political behavior. And then we also have this whole broader post-socialist situation. There's the Holocaust narratives that are part of the EU as well, and many other sites of genocide. Here's just a very interesting book. I don't know if anyone has come across this book by Jelena Subotic. She did a good job of, as you can see, Holocaust remembrance after communism. So it's a pioneering work for the former Yugoslavia, but also more broader in the region. So as promised, I also said I would talk a little bit about memory politics. So I don't know actually where the teachers are coming from. I'm guessing all kinds of backgrounds, probably mostly history or something like that. Maybe you've come across this idea of memory studies, if it's a concept at all. There are many, many theories, and I could show you, do a whole lecture again to deconstruct it. I'll just give you a few to work with. So this is a German scholar, Aleida Assmann, and there's many different ways to break down how we think about the past, but I thought this four formats that she uses are quite interesting. So we have kind of individual memory, and this is neuroscience, so we don't really talk about that. We talk more about collective memory, or maybe a different term I would use is collective remembrance, because it's an act. It's not like we're imagining the history, whether it's the United States or Croatia or Germany. There are actors and politicians and political institutions that craft that narrative. It's remembrance. It's a very active thing. It's the holidays we observe. It's the textbooks we read. It's the flags we look at. It's the memorial museums we go to. Those are formatting this collective remembrance. And so she argues there's a social memory, which is generational. So after a war, it's like the first 30 years or so, everyone is still talking about it. People have lived through it. Your parents, your brothers, your neighbors. It's still a living thing. Or I don't know, in the US, where I had grown up in during 9/11 was, a very powerful moment for thinking about that era in the US history. And then we have something called political memory, and I've highlighted it here because this is where I think the former Yugoslavia is right now. About 30 years after the conflict is over, the memory has become institutionalized. There are all the museums, there's the textbooks, there's the curriculum, there are all the monuments, the school trips to the various places. There's generally more or less a consensus to it. And that's why I think it's particularly interesting to observe the War of the 90s, but again, the Holocaust and genocide also plays a role here because, as I said, it's intertwined. And the final level, which she calls cultural memory, that's almost like the mythical stories. For Croatia, it's when the Croats showed up to the Adriatic Sea in the 7th century. The King Tomislav, was he the first king? It doesn't, it's a construction much deeper. Now, a more practical term or concept, which I think is useful for us, is this sites of memory or site of memory, which the French historian Pierre Nora coined the term, but his is a little bit more poetic and philosophical, I would say. And I prefer Jay Winters, and he's a historian of the First World War. And I think I use this blurb or paragraph with my students to try to get them to understand when they have an assignment to go out into their hometown and find a site of memory. So my students often are tasked to look at a monument or a mural, or it could be something else even. It can be non-material, a site of memory. It could be an anthem. But for practical purposes, let's talk about physical sites of memory. And then I have them take a photograph, and then they understand, when was it built? How is it used? Is it forgotten? So on and so forth. So here's Jay Winters' definition. Collective shared knowledge of the past. You can, create a sense of unity and individuality. And a group that goes to such sites inherits earlier meanings attached to the event, as well as adding new meanings. So it could be a monument to a concentration camp like Jasenovac. So people were going there, and depending on how much time I have, people were going there during socialism. There was certain kinds of commemorations that were taking place, and now there's different kinds of commemorations because now we're in independent Croatia. Uh, and this is also an interesting observation, is when these groups disperse or disappear, sites of memory lose their initial force and they may fade away entirely. If there's no one left alive that remembers it, like a monument to the, I don't know, the First World War, the War of 1860, or some other kind of war. I mean, in the United States, the Civil War has now become relevant again, but in Europe, there's some wars from the 19th century and no one knows what happened there. Uh, so these sites look as if they're there forever, but they can also be transitory, again, depending on how they're used. So here's an example of a monument I found. It's in a village. There used to be a Serbian village. These are victims of fascism. In the 1990s, this village, the population left or were forced out during 1995. And then the population that settled here were Croats from Bosnia. So it's a new population that took over the village. And so this monument is irrelevant to them. They're names and people that have nothing to do with the families that live there now. So as you can see, so overgrown, you can't even get to it. And now zooming in more and more into the Holocaust memory, which in fact, Holocaust studies is in a great part responsible for the creation of the entire field and discipline of memory studies, because it's the oral history, the commemorations, the building of all these things. So, there's quite a close connection between what we're talking about here in Holocaust memory and memory studies more broadly. And at the beginning of the 19th century and early 20th century, if you think about monuments, especially in Europe, most of the monuments were, the general on a horse or some commander or a leader, a king. And then with the First World War and the mass deaths that were going on there, it became democratized. Suddenly you had monuments to the average soldier and the unknown soldier. And then after the Second World War, because of the huge loss of life of civilians, suddenly civilian victims become dominant in the narratives. And now we also have, I've written here, globalization in memory, and taking different ideas and ways of remembering from different countries, from different contexts, that take place. And that image down there was actually from Lithuania. And we can also talk about different ways that the Holocaust was remembered, let's say in Western Germany and in Eastern Germany. There were different approaches because it served different purposes. And so maybe some of you have been to Auschwitz, Birkenau, or at least have seen movies or lectures about it. So it's a very powerful place to go. And I mean, it's, the dominant sort of memory trope of the Holocaust. And I think in many ways, also movies like Schindler's List, which isn't necessarily at Auschwitz, but has constructed an image of what a concentration camp is and what the Holocaust is. But we also have to understand that there were many, many different types of camps and forms. And this is a big issue for dealing with Jasenovac, as you'll see, and maybe you've seen it in images from Emil, but the image on the upper right hand with the remnants of the barracks, these chimneys that's standing out there on this plain. And it's like so shocking. You can see, wow, there was a camp here and these other barracks that still exist. It's like, all right, something happened here. You get to Jasenovac and it's just an empty space. And you're like, are they making it up? Do we question it? What if it was all a lie? Come up with the communists. So it's very interesting to think about our images of a concentration camp. What's like the standard stereotypical one, which I think Auschwitz is, and the many different other kinds of camps that exist. And I had an opportunity to go there with 700 Italian high school kids. This was about 15 years ago, and it was a very powerful moment when you actually go to these sites of memory. So they do serve an important purpose. One of the texts I gave you was by Hayden White, I believe. I'm pretty sure its emplotment. This is his book, but I gave you the title of the article was different. But he's an interesting philosopher, not necessarily, or actually a literary critic, I would say, or a comparative literature professor, because he started deconstructing how we tell stories and how narratives function. Because we were always assuming, history is truth, history is uh, an exact um, story about the past, but it's not. It's like, when do we start the story? Um, if the Second World War story begins, in 1944 with Eastern Prussia and the Germans that had lived there for centuries being chased out by the Red Army, or do you start in 1939 with German aggression on Poland? So it's like the starting and point and the end point is so important. So he used literary theory to actually deconstruct historical narratives and say it's not just what we write about, it's how we write about it. And so here, for example, he says, one narrative account may present a given set of events in the form and meaning of an epic or tragic story, while another account may present the same set of events with equal plausibility and without any violence to the factual record by describing it as farce. So what he was specifically talking about was this story of these Germans that had lived in what is today Poland and in Kaliningrad, having this epic escape where they're like getting on the ship and the Red Army's coming and they're saved. So it is a nice story, but because of that, the Red Army didn't liberate Auschwitz for, a couple more months, and I don't know, some thousands more people died because the Germans heroically were defending Eastern Prussia. So yes, it was a heroic moment, but in fact, it's a tragedy overall. So I think this allows us to try to understand why they are contested narratives, how people can look at the same set of facts and the truth, but really come away with many different narratives. And I want you to also think about not just the narrative and the history, but it's the memory. Like it's not just the fact that there's a monument to something; it's what the monument looks like. And as Sandra mentioned, my current project is looking at murals and graffiti. And Northern Ireland is the probably most famous part. Is there a question, or is it a?
No, no, there's just a comment, so don't worry. I will alert you if there's a question
Okay.
on the chat. Yeah.
So I thought, this image is also telling because it shows memory murals in Northern Ireland talking about the Troubles and two different approaches. One shows the good lads from the neighborhood who at night would put on ski masks and kill innocent Catholic civilians, and children walk by this and then they're basically being glorified, this Ulster volunteer force. Is that the kind of memoryscape a society wants to have? Or in Derry, we see peacemakers and bridge builders from John Hume, who's a Northern Irish or a politician from Northern Ireland, and Martin Luther King Jr., Nelson Mandela, etc. So its decisions are made by political actors and sometimes bottom up, other kinds of social actors that determine how to create a monument. Now, I have a series of monuments which I had called contested memorials in the past, and it's a little bit of an exercise with a few uh, images and sites, which each of them have a longer story about it. So, has anyone been to this place in Berlin? Is there someone writing in the?
They were commenting that first that the murals in Northern Ireland are really fascinating, and we do have several people who have said they have been to this particular place. Maria, Lori, and I believe Ryan and Donna. So they have been to this particular place in Berlin.
Okay, so this goes back to one of my earlier slides where I showed a figurative monument and then I showed like an abstract monument. And, for maybe some of you think that like an image of a human figure depict suffering more powerfully than this very abstract seeming uh, memorial site, which is, quite fascinating if you get lost in there, and there's all kinds of different meanings to it. And the problem is some people don't know what they're looking at. And I don't know if people have been aware of the controversies that were there, but even when I was there a couple times, kids are running in the passageways, people are eating sandwiches on this monument. This is a monument to the murdered Jews of Europe. And then here are a bunch of people running around taking selfies, posting them. What do we do with this kind of, I don't know, dark tourism, memorial porn? I don't know what we would call it. And there was an initiative called Holocaust of an Israeli, I think he was actually a comedian, and he took images from the internet of people posing there and then superimposing them on actual scenes of the Holocaust. And I think it was like 12 people that were kind of called out by it, and they all apologized publicly. We didn't know, we didn't understand. So I guess my point here is even memorialization is very tricky. Even when you think you found the proper way to do it, maybe it doesn't speak to the other, is this really transmitting the story that we wanted to tell? Uh, then there's you build a monument not to remember something, but actually to deny or hide something else that happened. Now, this is a scene from, or an image from Bosnia-Herzegovina. It's related to the wars of the 1990s and the Srebrenica genocide. And we see here two monuments, one from the 1950s. It's a World War II monument, and then a new monument to soldiers from that had fought on the Serbian side in the 1990s in Bosnia-Herzegovina. And you can say, well, a fallen soldier, they probably deserve to have a monument. Now, the choice of this image is also perhaps problematic for those people who know the Balkans better. But the problem is not the monuments itself, but the fact that this is one of the killing sites of the Srebrenica genocide. There was a dam there, Petkovci, and I don't actually know the number, but it's probably like 120 people or maybe even more were killed there. There's no memorialization to that. So in a way, by remembering something, you're actually hiding or denying the much bigger and horrific crime that took place there. Now, this is the topic that Katarina will talk to you about in your next session. So I'm not going to get into too many details, but this motto or this slogan, this Za dom spremni, was used by the Ustasha in the Second World War, and I think maybe some of the other lectures already commented on it, and then it was used again in the 1990s by some paramilitary forces, and then now it's just exploded. But again, I'll let Katarina handle all the fine details of it. But the problem was that in 2017, maybe even it might have even been late 2016, this plaque showed up in Jasenovac in the village of Jasenovac, so really close to the memorial site, and it had this image on the plaque, two soldiers that died in the 1990s. But it was, it was a big scandal because here is the phrase that the perpetrators of Jasenovac used right next to a site of the victims of those crimes. So it perpetuated or prompted, I should say, prompted historical commission and dealing with the past, and there were hemming and hawing and what to do with this. And again, she'll get into the details with you in the next session. But eventually, the monument was moved, so they didn't destroy it; they just moved it, and they put it in this probably about 40 kilometers in another memorial park, also related to the Homeland War. So you can see that in the background. But what you don't really see is even further in the background, there's a dark shape that used to be a partisan monument that was blown up in the 1990s. So I guess I didn't really, I should have said that at some point, that like in the 1990s, in the war, thousands of monuments were actually destroyed or removed. And then new monuments were being built. But that's more of a different lecture. So the monument moved, but not really dealt with. Now, maybe some of you know about this monument. This is in Budapest, and it was erected also about 10 years ago, I think, by the Orban government. And in the first instance, you might think, well, okay, they're recognizing the German occupation in 1944. There was also, it's like some references to the Holocaust there. Uh, this is a good job. But in fact, what it's doing is it's hiding Hungarian accountability. And the Hungarian troops also participated in the Holocaust, especially when the um, Arrow Cross was uh, came to power there as well. And here, the image of the monument is innocent Hungary being attacked by the German eagle. So the Nazis were all to blame, and then after that came Soviet occupation, and so the Hungarians were always victims. But this is an interesting moment when people power can do something because citizens were like, no, you are actually hiding a big part of the truth, which is that the Hungarian state was complicit in the Holocaust. In fact, there were Jewish laws even in the 1930s, even before the Second World War. And the Hungarian government was an eager ally of the Nazi regime. They were, collaborators with them. The, the Jews weren't immediately sent off to the camps, and that happens after 44, but they were in labor camps and work groups and stripped of all kinds of rights. So this is the counter memorial in front of the official memorial. I think that shows us that when the state tries to build monuments, when the state tries to impose a particular narrative or the truth about history or the past, there can be pushback and there are different ways of doing it. And then people will be standing out here and this impromptu memorial and giving lectures and talking to passersby, etc. And it was still there last time I went last year. I don't know if it's there today. And since I believe many of you are also from the United States, and so just to, suggest these memory politics or monumental politics also affects the U.S. Of course, not genocide in those terms or the Holocaust, of course, but in different traumatic pasts. And we know about the removal of monuments and also the building of new memorial sites. And here's a question, again, going back to the aesthetics, how do we depict this traumatic past? This is the one at the Memorial for Peace and Justice. And as the New York Times reported on it when it opened, this monument is meant to perturb, not to console. Monument was supposed to shock you. Now, again, maybe this can be something for discussion, how people think about, how should a monument look like? Should you feel comfortable going there to educate, or do you want to be shocked and horrified? Now, there's different approaches to it. And the big question, this is the other article I gave you by James Young, The Texture of Memory. And I've already shown you a little bit about Auschwitz, but this is what the gas chambers looked like. And when the Soviet army came in there, they found the Germans had tried to blow him up, and they found these ruins. And there was like, what do we do with these ruins? Do we rebuild them? What do we do? They decided, let's leave them as they looked like. And that's the difficulty was, how do we make the central monument of Auschwitz? How do we embody this horror, whatever happened, in one monument? Is it a mother and a child? Is it many victims? And instead, they decided to make a monument of ruins. So the monument is abstract and looks like the destroyed stones of those gas chambers that are there. So it's also a very interesting approach. And in front, you can see the plaques for all the different countries of the people that their citizens died in this camp. And there's also not just monuments, but also museums, like resistance museums. This one in Copenhagen in Denmark, you'd think that they were, fighting off everybody. In fact, there was quite a bit of collaboration or, peaceful or passive resistance. But they're very proud of that. And as an aside, and this is for, definitely Sandra and other people from this region, we had the partisans and the partisan anti-fascist resistance so heroic, so many challenges they fought against. They fought against true evil. And the fact that in Croatia there is no World War II resistance museum, that we're embarrassed about this past, that's so frustrating that the other narratives sometimes dominate and are louder than this heroic story that happened. And in fact, Jasenovac is the only sort of World War II museum that exists in a way. So, and it's transnational. So maybe some of you have been to the museum in DC. And this slide is to think about how we interact with the past. What does a commemoration look like? The two scenes on the right are from a film called Sretna Zemlja, or Happy Land, and it follows different groups of people in Croatia going to do different commemorations. One celebrating Tito in Kumrovec, and the other one going to Bleiburg, this site of communist crimes. And it's actually quite interesting why people go there. Like sometimes people are drinking on the bus, and other times they're hiding their Ustasha gear. It's a very fascinating film. But to make it a film that might be more relevant, I guess, for if you're studying the Holocaust, is this film Austerlitz. And I'm not sure if anyone's seen that one. It's a difficult movie to watch, not because it's violent, but it's really just the camera watching people go to Dachau and um, Sachsenhausen outside of Berlin. So there's no commentary, there's no narrative. It's just his camera watching people walk around looking at gas chambers, doing selfies in there. It's actually a very fascinating study of human behavior at these sites of memory. So if you are interested in watching that, I recommend it. I showed it to my students, or showed it to students before going to Dachau, and they were so well behaved when they went there. They were just like super sensitive to it. It's actually quite interesting. Now, I think I have like about 10 minutes left, so I'm going to end with I've tried to give you an idea of some Holocaust memory broadly, some memory studies, ideas and theories, a few monument interventions, and now I'm returning back to where I started with Jasenovac, and to look how this functioned and how this changed. Again, I don't know how much Emil got into the post-war discussion of it, but as you see, the museum opened in 1968, so it was almost like 30 years after Second World War. So that's that political memory that Aleida Asman talks about, and that's when this happened. And it's a landscape that there are no barracks here. How do you portray or convey the terror of this concentration camp when you have nothing to show? And, they had some landscape memorialization, these sort of mounds where the buildings were, but it's all very abstract, which on one hand, it's a powerful statement, but on the other hand, it allows Holocaust deniers to say, oh, there was nothing there. Where are the bodies? Show us the truth. And how did this memorial museum look like? Well, in the first exhibit, it was very classical, socialist era, heroic kind of narrative. There are objects, talked a little bit about the past, but it was really more of a partisan museum that happened to be there. But they decided by the 80s to change the exhibit. And the second exhibit was what many people I've talked to remember. And it was an atrocity exhibit. It showed corpses, bodies, executions. Students, kids were taken there on field trips. I mean, like my mother's friend said she'd gotten sick and like even almost fainted while going there. So that's the other extreme. Also, interesting, they took cadets in the Yugoslav People's Army to go there and observe this thing. So that's the instrumentalization of the past, because very soon those troops are going to be fighting a war. And if your enemy is the Ustasha, who were Croats, did this, the new Croatian government is just like this and they're going to kill us again. So you can see how the past can very easily be not as a message of never again, and like let's not let this happen, but in fact, we have to, fight against the new enemy. And there was some research also showing how many of the photos in this exhibition, in fact, weren't even from Jasenovac. They were from other Holocaust sites or places in Yugoslavia where there were death and the numbers were being exaggerated and so on. There was even, talking about the layers of memory, there was battles that were fought there in the 1990s. This is related to that plaque that you saw earlier. You can see the memorial site in the background there. And there are many debates going on to this day, how many people were killed there, from 700,000 and 1 million to
All right, thank you.
to many less, or even saying that only like 2,000 people died there. So, but I'm not going to get too much into those debates because, again, that's a whole nother lecture. And then the third exhibition was opened in 2006 after being renovated. And this is the former Croatian prime minister. So, I mean, there's all kinds of critique about this, and we can talk about that later. It's had some updates since the 2006, but for example, someone called it postmodern trash. It's the only World War II museum effectively in Croatia. There's a few smaller ones, but more or less this is it. And is it a museum of the Second World War? Is it a museum of the Holocaust? Or is it a museum of Ustaša genocide against Serbs, Roma, also Jews, and anti-fascists? So there's many different ways that this museum can be portrayed, is portrayed, and has been portrayed. And many times it's been a lot of them. One of the big issues was the initial depiction of the names of the victims was just, it's in the upper left-hand corner, just names with no context. And people complained, like, you can't really get the sense of who these people were. And so they later added this rolling list of names with ethnic identity that were added there. So that was one intervention. And the question of perpetrators. Do we show perpetrators in these museums? This is the only image of a perpetrator in the museum, and it's Ante Pavlakovic visiting Hitler, but nowhere else do you see them. So, I mean, I had written quite a critical text about it, and I think the decision to make an atmosphere of this sort of memorial museum that evokes sort of anxiety, depression, malaise somehow was chosen instead of a factual museum that tells you what really happened there. And again, we can also talk about that. Does the museum hide the past, or does it really show it? So these are different interpretations. And now just to wrap up, to just also say how it continues to be instrumentalized. And for many years, there were multiple commemorations there because the state delegates were fighting against the anti-fascists and against the Serb community and then against the Jewish community. So that was totally chaotic. Now they've sort of gotten back together to do one. And then it affects international relations with Serbia because the biggest number of victims there, as you know, were Serbs. For Serbia, this is a very traumatic site, but it's also used often to kind of depict contemporary Croatian, even left-wing anti-fascist Croats as Ustaše, and they're just always continuing the policy of Jasenovac even to this day. There's been cultural representations, whether this very powerful film, Dnevnik Dijane Budisavljević, about saving of children, Serb children, during the war, or this Dara of Jasenovac, which seems to be more of like a propaganda kind of film and doing it. And then it even goes to the crazy level because of those spomeniks, as I mentioned, the commodification. This is a commercial for sunglasses. So they used a Holocaust site and a monument to sell sunglasses in Australia. Luckily, activists in Croatia wrote to them, and then this was pulled. But um, this is kind of in line with that monument in Berlin, where when something's too abstract, it looks cool, but you lose the meaning that it really has. And then the Holocaust has some other sites now in Zagreb. So this was a relatively recent monument, and it was controversial because initially they wanted to make it to a monument to all 6 million Jews that were killed in the Holocaust. But again, a monument that seems to remember something, but it was ignoring the fact that Ustasha and the Croatian fascists were also directly responsible for the murder of at least thousands of Jews and complicit in the Holocaust. So eventually they were able to add this in memory of the victims of the Holocaust and the Ustasha regime. So we can see how monuments can be so contested. Just one sentence can change the entire meaning of a site. There was this also talk about this Holocaust museum that has not been realized. And I guess I'll just end here, and then we can open up questions. Distortions are still going on, victimization narratives still present in art and culture, and affecting international relations within Croatia, but also with our neighbors. And the other side of the coin with the Ustasha symbolism and memory, as I said, that's what Katarina will be talking about with you in the next session. So I guess I'll stop here then, and we can